Imagine you have just taken the throne after a great upheaval amid the ruins of a vast empire. In your hands lie an army, taxes, and the authority to determine what is true. Chroniclers await your word to write history anew, while a court stands ready to punish any dissenters. But outside the windows of your palace stand colossal buildings, columns weighing hundreds of tons, and the ruins of ancient cities, the construction technology of which even your best engineers cannot comprehend. These stones are a silent threat. For the people, they serve as daily proof that a civilization once existed, infinitely surpassing your power, knowledge, and might. With a single decree, these inexplicable structures can be declared the heritage of your dynasty, their true creators erased from memory, and the majestic palaces with baffling functions hurriedly adapted to meet your needs, even if it means hauling coal in buckets and living without sewage. What will you choose? To honestly confess that you are merely a barbarian who has occupied someone else's magnificent ruins, or to compel history to be rewritten so that these cyclopean edifices are regarded as your personal architectural triumph? Now let's see how it looked in real history. There is a story that official textbooks tell only halfway. The first half is about architecture. Who built it? When? In what style? How many columns? What kind of marble? All of this is documented well. The second half is about what happened afterward, when the buildings were already standing, when people lived inside them, when all of this was supposed to function. This half is significantly more interesting, because when you start reading not textbooks but primary sources, official reports, testimonies from health inspectors, travel diaries, court records, parliamentary documents, the picture turns out to be strange. Not in a mystical sense, but in the sense of mismatch. The buildings clearly possess more potential than the people inside them are capable of utilizing. Like an expensive tool in the hands of someone who doesn't know what it was made for. The building is mastered. The function of the building, the function is not. This isn't a question of true owners or who it belonged to. It is an engineering question. Here is the building. Here are the people inside it. How do they use it? What do they do? And, most precisely, what can't they do, even though the building seems to allow it? Today, several specific places. Each is well known. Each is explained separately, but together they form a picture that official explanations prefer not to assemble. In each case, the shell exists, but understanding doesn't align with it. 1893, Chicago, the World's Columbian Exposition. The formal reason is the 400th anniversary of the discovery of America, a year late. That doesn't matter. What matters is this. On the shores of Lake Michigan, a city rises in just a few months. Not fair tents and not wooden pavilions. The city. 14 main buildings in imperial classic style. Columns, domes, balustrades, wide staircases, canals with gondolas, fountains. The area of construction is over 250 hectares. It was called the White City because the facades are white and because at night it burned with electric light, which most visitors had never seen before. Arc lamps, hundreds of thousands of electric bulbs. Night illumination on such a scale, a world first. 27 million visitors in 6 months. That's more than the then population of the United States. People traveled from Europe specifically just to see it. Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed the landscape of the exhibition, recalled how elderly people cried upon entering the grounds. They described it as a vision of Rome emerging from the water. Officially, it is explained this way. American architects and builders performed brilliantly, completing the task in record time, a national triumph, a demonstration of the technical prowess of a young country. Okay, then let's delve into one detail, the one that's overlooked in this explanation. The material from which all these buildings are made is called staff. It is a mixture of gypsum, Portland cement, lime, and jute fibers. In appearance, it closely resembles white marble or limestone. In terms of characteristics, it serves as a temporary covering several centimeters thick over a wooden frame. Ancient columns were cast in wooden molds, with each one taking about 30 minutes to produce. Friezes, cornices, and relief panels are also cast. Inside, there's wood, metal ties, and jute wrapping. On the outside, there's white gypsum. Now calculate. The cost of the entire complex was $28 million at that time. That's about $700 million in today's prices. This was just for the temporary structures made of plaster and wood. The exhibition closed in October 1893. By the spring of the following year, most of the buildings had been dismantled or had burned down. At first glance, everything is clear. A holiday, an American splurge, a desire to make an impression. There was money, they spent it. Temporarily means temporarily. But then, one question. If you have $28 million and the best architects in the country, why use plaster? Not because it can't be done in stone, but because there wouldn't be enough time for stone. Construction began in 1891. 2 years for 14 enormous buildings. Gypsum. It's not about savings. Gypsum. It's about speed. Pour the mold. In 30 minutes, you pull out a finished column. Another 30, the next one. Set it up, level it, whitewash it. With any other material, you simply wouldn't keep up. Remember this feeling. Calculate how many molds are needed to cast a column in 30 minutes. The mold is wooden, precise, with carefully crafted grooves for flutes. Such a mold needs to be made first. For columns of 3 different orders, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, 3 different molds are required. Plus molds for capitals, which are unique to each order. Plus molds for bases, friezes, metopes. That's hundreds of unique molds. They need to be designed, manufactured, and tested before the main construction begins. This alone is work that takes several months. But once everything is ready, production flows like a conveyor belt. 30 minutes per column. This is not craftsmanship. This is industry. It understands proportions. It can reproduce a dome, Ionic capitals, a coffered ceiling, a 3-tiered arcade. Does this in plaster over 2 years. Because otherwise, there simply wouldn't be enough time physically. The original buildings in this style are made of granite, marble, solid limestone. According to the official version, they took decades to complete. The difference is not in money. The difference is that a copy and an original are made using different processes. A copy is made by knowing what the original looks like. The original is made differently, or completely differently. And here is the first question to ask oneself. If a style can be accurately reproduced, it means it exists somewhere in memory. Not in an abstract, cultural memory, but in specific blueprints, proportions, modules. Someone has preserved them. Someone has worked with them. But why did that someone have neither the time nor the material to do it properly, but only like this, for 2 seasons, from plaster? This is a question without an answer, but it is precise. Gypsum outdoors in the Great Lakes climate deteriorates quickly. 1 or 2 seasons with temperature fluctuations lead to cracks, delaminations, and pieces collapsing. Builders were aware of this. That is why the White City was designed as temporary, not because they couldn't find money for preservation, but because it was intended that way. A disposable Rome. It is a reproduction of an image, not the creation of a building. Here is what is essential. The exhibition architects, who worked with plaster and wood, were educated on classical examples. They studied the Pantheon, the Colosseum, the porticos of Athens, and the basilicas of Rome. They understood modules. They understood proportions. They reproduced them accurately, down to the flutes on the Ionic column, to the design of the coffered ceiling. They knew the style exceedingly well. But building in this style using real materials was impossible. Not in 2 years, and not even in 20. Because the original buildings in this style, with solid marble columns, coffered stone ceilings, and granite staircases, officially took decades to construct. How exactly they were built remains unknown. Not a single complete technological description of how the Pantheon, the Baalbek temples, or Hadrian's villa with its unique brickwork without binding mortar was erected has survived. There is a result. There are plaster copies of the result, but the process, there is none. And here's what is curious. One of the main architects of the exhibition, Charles McKim, specifically traveled to Rome before starting the design, measuring buildings, sketching details, photographing. He did this not as a tourist. He did it as a person who needed an exact model, because without a model, he could not create it. He could only copy. And he copied, precisely, professionally, to scale. But from plaster, because otherwise, he wouldn't have enough time, wouldn't be able to manage, wouldn't understand. This is the difference between those who create and those who reproduce. The former builds from understanding. The latter operates from a template. Remove the template, and there will be nothing to reproduce. A civilization that once had real marble now shapes it from plaster. And it spends the country's budgets to feel for 6 months what it once was, or what it wants to appear to be. Now, a detail that almost nobody discusses in connection with the White City. The exhibition featured advanced sewage and electric lighting systems. The entire area was connected by an internal transportation system. Exemplary infrastructure within the perimeter of the fence. 2 blocks away from the exit gates are the workers' slums. No running water, no sewage, no electric light. Manure in the streets, typhoid water from communal wells, tuberculosis in the boarding houses. Literally, just 1 street separated the White City from the Middle Ages. Calculate the distance, not in meters, in meaning. Inside the perimeter of the enclosure, electric arc lamps, sewage pipes, filtered water, moving sidewalks. Outside, cholera. This is not just social inequality. These are 2 different infrastructural realities coexisting just 100 meters apart. And yet, no one thinks to simply run a pipe outside. The exhibition is over there. Life is here. They do not connect. People knew how to create an exemplary infrastructure, but only within a temporary fenced space. Outside, they couldn't for decades. They were able to mold Rome out of plaster in 2 years. But building a proper water supply system in a working-class neighborhood, they could not. It's not about money. There was money. It's about the difference between what could be reproduced as an image and what was understood as a functioning system. The exhibition closed. A few months later, a fire. Plaster and wood burn well. Only one building out of 14 remains, the Palace of Fine Arts. It was later rebuilt in stone because it had to remain alone. The others, plaster, wood, 2 winters, fire. And here it's worth taking a step aside. Not far, just to compare with one figure from another place, from another decade. Street. Petersburg. The year is 1837. The Winter Palace is on fire. The blaze lasts for 3 days. When the fire is extinguished, nothing remains inside. Collapsed ceilings, charred walls, burned-out halls. 1,500 rooms. Nicholas I issues an order: restore completely, in 1 year. Not begin restoration, not prepare a project. Restore. Turnkey, parquet, gilding, malachite, jasper, stucco. 1,500 rooms in 365 days. Calculate it. That's 4 rooms a day. Every day. 4 rooms from scratch. The parquet is laid. The walls are finished. The stucco is in place. The gilding is applied. The marble is installed. 4 rooms. A day. Every day for a year straight. Officially, it is explained this way: the authoritarian will of the monarch plus cheap labor. Okay, let's assume that's true. But then there's one question. The same cheap labor in the same city during the same decades built new buildings, and that took years. St. Isaac's Cathedral took 40 years. It's the same Petersburg, the same workers, the same tools, the same labor force. Yet there, 40 years, here, 1 year for 1,500 rooms. The difference is not in the money, not in the will of the monarch. It's something else. And now, one more detail about the Winter Palace. The building, which was restored in a year, is not just large. It covers 233,000 square meters. It has almost 2,000 windows. It was heated by wood-burning stoves. In most of the large halls, there were 17 fireplaces. To maintain the temperature throughout the building, an army of stokers was required. Hundreds of individuals who moved thousands of cubic meters of firewood up the grand staircases every few hours. Despite all this, according to contemporary accounts, in rooms just a few meters from the fireplace, the temperature rarely rose above 15 degrees. The aristocracy lived in fur coats inside the palace. The same civilization that recreated interiors made of jasper and malachite in just 1 year was unable to implement steam heating. The principles of the steam boiler were already known by that time. They were used in factories. Yet in the Winter Palace, firewood, stokers, and 15 degrees by the window. Look at the figure from a different perspective. 1,500 rooms in a year. This includes parquet floors made from unique wood species with geometric patterns that do not repeat from hall to hall. Each fireplace portal made of malachite. The mineral is sourced from a single location in the Urals, polished by hand, requiring the correct orientation of layers for the pattern to match. Marble pilasters, with precise flutings proportioned accurately. Ceiling moldings with 3-dimensional reliefs. 4 rooms per day. Each one different. They know how to do it. They do it with such confidence that it appears as if they are reproducing from a catalog rather than creating. But the heating system for the same building, that's a different story. Heating has to be devised independently, and that they cannot do. It's the same logic as in Chicago with plaster. They can replicate the image, they can do that. Understanding how it should actually work, that's another story. But let's not stray too far from Chicago, because this very city, in the same century, did something that deserves a separate discussion. Look at a mid-19th century map of Chicago and one figure, the groundwater level, almost at the pavement level. The city is built on a swamp. Not next to a swamp, on a swamp. After rains, the streets turned into knee-deep liquid mud. Waste didn't go into a sewer system, there was none, but flowed directly into the Chicago River, from which drinking water was taken. 3 cholera epidemics in 20 years, 1832, 49, 54. Not catastrophes, the norm. A regular consequence of life in a city built without understanding the ground. In the year 1855, city engineer Ellis Chesbrough proposed a solution, simple in concept and fantastic in scale, to raise the entire city, literally, physically, to lift the buildings, sidewalks, and streets 1.5 to 2.5 meters and lay a sewer system beneath them. And they did it. First, they simply added a layer on top of the wooden sidewalks. Then came the paved streets. Next, they turned to the buildings. The technology is like this. Screw jacks are positioned under the foundation, hundreds and thousands of them. Teams of workers are stationed around the perimeter of the building. On command, simultaneously, each one makes exactly one turn. The building rises evenly, millimeter by millimeter, without tilting, without cracks. The next command, another turn. And so it goes, layer by layer, until the building reaches the desired height. In 1856, the Tremont House Hotel was raised, a 5-story brick building, 750 workers, 5,000 jacks. The lifting took several days, while inside the hotel, life went on as usual. Guests dined in the restaurant on the first floor. Clerks worked at the front desk. There were no interruptions in work. The building slowly moved upward. None of the guests noticed anything. Stop. Let's pause. Try to imagine how it looks technically. 5,000 jacks mean 5,000 separate points of support. The load is distributed unevenly. It's greater under the load-bearing walls and less under the internal partitions. Therefore, more jacks are placed under the load-bearing walls, and their rotations are made more frequently than under the lighter sections. Otherwise, the building would tilt, and the brickwork would start to crack. This has to be calculated in advance. Each support point requires its own lifting frequency. 750 people receive instructions. This row, 1 rotation for every 3 commands. That row, 1 rotation for every 2. A signaling system, a coordinator in the center, and there you go. The building rises while people inside are having lunch. This is not improvisation. You don't do it like this on the first try. It's accumulated experience. A school, 750 people, a synchronized turn on command. Otherwise, the building will tilt and destruction will begin. This requires precise mathematical calculations of loads on every point of support, an understanding of how mass is distributed across the foundation, professional trained teams, a clear signaling system, and strict coordination of the entire process. This is an engineering school, tried and tested, serious. They knew how to do that in 1856, but they built the city on a swamp, without drainage, without calculating the groundwater level during the construction, initially without sewage. This is the most fundamental mistake in site selection for a city, which was then rectified over decades at the cost of tens of millions of dollars. How to reconcile it in one mind? There is a technique that requires mathematics, trained teams, precise coordination, and an understanding of load distribution. This exists. But there is also a basic thing: to look at the map, see the peat bog, and say, "No, we cannot build here. This does not exist." Or it existed but could not be applied. Or it was not wanted. Or it came later, already as foreign knowledge, which they took and used, not fully understanding where it comes from. The Robbins Building, 27,000 tons, was raised in 1856 by 70 centimeters. Not a single crack. The technology works. Knowledge exists. But what kind of knowledge? Knowledge of how to lift, and simultaneously ignorance of where to originally build. It appears as an inherited tool without context, like a recipe passed down without explanation of why this dish is needed. If we assume that this technology was not invented but inherited, then the picture takes on a different aspect. There were those before them who knew how to raise buildings. Someone developed a method of synchronized jacks, a system of signals, calculations of loads on support points. And somehow, this method made its way to the engineers of Chicago in the mid-19th century. However, the knowledge that explained where to build, where to source water, how drainage works, how a city should function as a whole, seems to have been lost along the way. The tools arrived. The context did not. Now, Seattle. The year is 1889. A great fire destroyed the business center, 25 blocks. The city council decided to rebuild at a new level, to raise the streets 3.5 to 9 meters above the old foundation. And this is where something happens that is important to remember. The construction of the new city progressed quickly, but while the upper level was being built, the residents continued to live on the lower one. For several years, Seattle existed in 2 layers of reality. The new sidewalk was already up high, at the level of the 2nd floor of the old building. The entrance to the store was down below, in a pit, at the level of the old 1st floor. Pedestrians walked up and down temporary wooden staircases. They descended, shopped, and then ascended. This went on for years. Ordinary city life, just with constant ups and downs. When the new city was completed, the old ground floors were not demolished. They were covered with paving and sidewalk tiles. They were left as they were. The basements of the former ground floors became true basements. For a while, shops continued to operate there. Then came brothels, opium dens, and storage for smugglers. The official city lived above. The unofficial one thrived in the darkness below. This is called the Seattle Underground. 35 blocks of underground galleries beneath the city center. It still exists today. A tourist route with tours several times a day. Tourists walk there with flashlights through dark corridors, listening to tales of how prostitutes and opium traders once lived in these basements. This is presented as a spicy story, a colorful page of urban folklore. But if you stop and think about what really happened, the picture is a bit different. A whole layer of the city, a whole level of life, stores, housing, streets, was simply covered over. Not demolished, not renovated, just covered. And a new city grew above, as if the previous one had never existed. If it was documented that this happened in Seattle, why are we so sure that in other cities the ground floors disappeared only for the reasons we know? Fire, that's documented. Bricked up, that too. Buried, also. All three scenarios exist. Seattle is one of the documented cases. How many more are there? But before we move on to the next city, there is one important point here. The discussion about the raising of buildings in Chicago inevitably leads to one question. Where did this technology come from in the first place? The synchronized raising of thousands of jacks is not something that is invented from scratch on a construction site in one season. It requires a precedent. Someone has done it before. Look at another example from the same era. St. Petersburg, the year 1832. The Alexander Column needs to be erected in Palace Square, a monolithic granite shaft measuring 47 meters in height and weighing around 800 tons, the heaviest monolith ever raised by man. In today's terms, planning the lifting of such an object would involve years of calculations, specialized equipment, and load modeling. In 1834, it was raised and installed in 1 hour and 45 minutes. 2,000 workers, a system of winches and pulleys. On command, all at once. The column was positioned on the pedestal vertically, without a single additional fastening. It stands on its own weight to this day. Without bolts, without brackets, without a foundation anchor. Just gravity. The columns of St. Isaac's Cathedral, each weighing 114 tons, were installed in just 45 minutes. 128 workers, also on command, also synchronously. 48 such columns. This is not an experimental technology. This is a well-established process. Now compare. In 1831, France decided to bring the Luxor obelisk from Egypt. 1. 220 tons. A barge was specially built. A tugboat was specially equipped. A place on the waterfront in Paris was specially prepared. The obelisk didn't fit the standard dimensions. The project took 6 years. It cost 2.5 million francs. The second obelisk, which Egypt offered for free, France refused to take. Too expensive. 1 monolith, 6 years and a state budget. For the authors of St. Isaac's Cathedral, 114 tons in 45 minutes, 48 times in a row. This is not the same level of capabilities. These are different systems. One of them clearly knows something that the other does not. And this knowledge, it seems, is not invented, but inherited. From where is a separate conversation. But the fact remains. The technology for lifting and moving in mid-19th century Petersburg works more effectively than in Paris at the same time. The explanation of cheap labor does not apply here. France could also hire workers. It's not about the number of people. It's about the method. And the method, clearly not the same for everyone. Because there is another city, much older, And there, much deeper, Edinburgh, Scotland. Beneath the city administration building that stands on the Royal Mile is a bricked-up street. Mary King's Close. Not a cellar, not a service corridor. There are houses there, fully fledged multi-story buildings with rooms, staircases, fireplaces, kitchens, remnants of shop signs. When, in the 18th century, they decided to expand construction in the old city, some of the adjacent alleys were included in the new development. The upper floors were demolished. The lower ones were left untouched. They became the supporting structures and foundation for the new building above. They simply bricked them up. They put up walls. They filled in the openings. And they built on top. Now, just one number. The houses in Mary King's Close are 12 stories tall. By the standards of the 17th century, this is an anomaly almost everywhere in Europe. At that time, such height was only granted to the most exceptional cathedrals, and even then, not everywhere. For a residential building, practically nowhere. Nonetheless, here they are. Now underground, but still standing. Stone masonry for 12 stories without a steel framework is not intuition. It's engineering. The walls of the lower floors must be several times thicker than those of the upper floors. Otherwise, the structure won't hold. Load calculations. Understanding how mass is distributed. An error in calculation can lead to collapse. Official history states that in the 17th century, buildings were constructed with a maximum of 5 or 6 floors, and even that was rare. Yet the building exists. It is documented. You can walk around it and touch it. However, the most important thing is not the height. What matters is how people lived in those houses. The dead end was located near Norloch, a lake in the valley north of the old town. Officially, it was a defensive moat by the castle. In reality, it was a city sewer. All the filth drained there. The smell was constant, especially in the summer. From the lower floors of the alley, reports of foul odor and bad air were regularly recorded. Let's analyze what bad air means in this context. The walled-off lower levels are a closed space, minimum ventilation. Nearby is an organic waste pit. When organic matter decomposes in confined, moist conditions, methane is released. Swamp gas. It is colorless and nearly odorless. Detecting its presence without instruments is difficult. However, the symptoms of chronic exposure at low concentrations are gradual. Headaches, sleep disturbances, irritability, a sense of an unseen presence, hallucinations. Urban legends about the ghosts of Mary King's Close are among the most enduring in Scotland. Tourists are delighted to hear them. Methane is mentioned less frequently in the same context. People weren't imagining things. They were breathing swamp gas. And they saw what swamp gas makes you see. This is neurochemistry, not folklore. Now imagine life in this place, not as a tourist with a flashlight, but as a resident. You live in a cramped, semi-subterranean space. Ventilation is minimal. Nearby is a rotting lake. In the evenings, your head starts to hurt. At night, strange dreams. Sometimes it seems like someone is standing in the corner. You don't know that it's gas. You only know that it's a bad place, a dreadful one, an unpleasant one. and you continue to live there, because you can't afford to pay for another place. It is the year 1902. It is the 20th century. The last tenants were evicted from the sealed-off rooms in 1902. Not in the 17th century, not in the 18th. In 1902. The London Underground is already in operation. There are already telephones and the first cars. Yet in Edinburgh, people live in a confined underground space next to a source of methane and pay rent. Historians explain urban poverty, cheap housing for those with nowhere to go. That's true. But above their heads is the city administration. The walls of the buildings where toxic gas-affected people live serve as the foundation for the official center of power. This is not a judgment on injustice. It is an observation about structure. A vast building, the lower levels used for whatever. The question, what's under the foundation, is not asked. It is unnecessary. It doesn't matter. Here's what else is important. The construction of the Royal Exchange, which covered the alley from above, took place in the year 1753. When the new building was being laid, no one conducted an inspection of the lower structures. They did not check the condition of the load-bearing walls of the houses that were to become part of the new foundation. They simply covered it and built. Essentially, the Edinburgh City Administration Building stands on a foundation whose condition was never checked during its construction. It still stands today. However, this does not imply that it was intended to be this way. It indicates that the 17th century builders, whose houses served as the foundation, understood their structures far better than the 18th century builders who decided to utilize them. Chicago is a city on a swamp. The technology for raising buildings has been mastered, yet the site for the city was originally chosen without understanding the ground. Seattle, a whole city goes down a level, 35 blocks underground, documented, a tourist route. Edinburgh, a street with 12-story buildings, is being bricked up for a new facade above, the last residence in the 20th century. The pattern is one: move upward, the old, downward. What's down there doesn't matter. But where can one go if the problem is not with the floor, but with the building itself? If the building was originally constructed not for those who moved in, the best example is not in Seattle and not in Edinburgh. The best example is the main palace of 18th century Europe, Versailles, a palace that became a symbol of absolute monarchy. More than 2,000 rooms. The Hall of Mirrors, 73 meters long, 750 mirrors, 20,000 candles. The residence of French kings from 1682 to 1789, 107 years. In peak years, the permanent population was around 10,000 people. Courtiers, servants, military personnel, craftsmen, petitioners, and musicians. Practically without permanent toilets. This is not a caricature. It is documented in memoirs, in reports from the palace administration, in dispatches from foreign ambassadors, in medical reports. Versailles has been officially recognized by historians as the most foul-smelling palace in the world. And this is not a metaphorical description. It is a literal assessment of the sanitary conditions supported by dozens of independent sources from different eras. Let's break this down specifically. Ladies at court carried portable porcelain vessels in fur muffs, cylindrical hand warmers. This was called bourdelue, named after the Jesuit preacher Louis Bourdelue, whose sermons lasted several hours. Court ladies could not leave during the service or audience. They resolved the issue differently. The vessel was concealed in the muff and used right in the crowd, whether in the gallery, in the hall, or at an official reception. Not as an exception, as a norm. Memoirists from several generations mention it quite calmly, as a matter of everyday life. The corridors of the palace in the mornings present a unique situation. Behind the curtains, under the staircases, in the niches by the windows, in the walls between the columns, everything was utilized. The servants cleaned, but they couldn't keep up. The palace was constantly expanding, and there was a chronic shortage of staff. Reports from the manager noted that waste from the cesspools beneath the wings was seeping into the living quarters of the lower floors. The smell of urine was ingrained in the upholstery, in the plaster, and in the parquet floors. Fresh-cut flowers, constantly, on all the tables and windowsills, were not characteristic of aristocratic taste. They were an attempt to mask the odor. Now, many will write, "It's just the era we live in. The sanitary services didn't understand. This is how it was everywhere." Fine. Then, one specific question. In the very same Versailles, in the same parks, during the same decades, complex hydraulic machines were at work. The machine de Marly was built in 1684. 14 water wheels, each with a diameter of up to 12 meters, 221 pumps, a multi-stage lifting of water to a height of 160 meters, an extensive network of pipes, reservoirs, check valves, and pressure regulators. All of this was designed, calculated, and operated to fill 400 fountains in the park. 400 fountains. And those same engineers, at the same time, for the same money, did not bring water to the palace toilets. Try to explain this from a technical perspective. Here is the machine of Marly. 14 wheels, 200 pumps, 160 meters of elevation. This is done. Next to it is a 500-meter building with thousands of residents. Bringing a water pipe into it is technically orders of magnitude simpler than building the machine. You need a pipe from the nearest reservoir, a slope for gravity flow, and that's it. No pumps, no wheels, just a pipe underground. This was known even in ancient Rome. In the very Pompeii, which we will talk about later, this worked 1,500 years before Versailles. And now we must speak separately about Pompeii, a provincial port city, not a capital, not an emperor's residence, just a town of 20,000 inhabitants by the shores of the Bay of Naples. Until the catastrophe of the year 79 AD, every street had a fountain with running water. Pipes ran from the aqueduct, and the pressure was calculated separately for each block to ensure that the flow did not diminish in the farther sections. There were separate troughs for animals next to the drinking fountains to avoid confusion. In public baths, there were 3 pools: hot, warm, and cold. The floor in the baths was heated through a system of underground channels with hot air, hypocaust. This system operated without pumps, relying on gravity and thermal convection. This is the province, the norm for the province. Versailles, the year 1683. The main palace of the first monarchy in Europe. The same engineers who calculated the pumps and pipes for the 400 fountains, and corridors, and ladies with porcelain vessels in muffs. A gap of 1,600 years. In that 1,600 years, the provincial port standard had not even spread to the royal residence. But in Versailles, they didn't do it. 400 fountains, yes. Toilets, no. It's not about money. It's not about ignorance. It's about where the thought is directed. Engineering thought is directed outward, to where the spectators are. There, effect is needed. There, demonstration is necessary. But inside, there are the residents, and they can manage on their own. There they are, in the park, hundreds of meters away. They knew how to calculate pressure. 14 wheels, 200 pumps, a lift of 160 meters. The principle of drainage by gravity is elementary. Technically, nothing impossible. But the toilets, they didn't do it. This is not ignorance. It is a specific kind of blindness. Engineering thought is directed outward, towards fountains, theatrical effects, and demonstrations of power. It is not directed inward, as if the internal functioning of a building is not their task. They make use of what is outside. As for what happens inside, well, it sort of takes care of itself. And here's what is interesting. This blindness was not an exception for just Versailles. It was the rule for the entire era. 1858. London. The Great Stink. The heat causes the Thames, into which all the city's waste flows, to emit a stench so foul that sheets soaked in bleach are hung on the windows of the Parliament building. Parliament operates under gas mask conditions. The richest empire on the planet, owning half the world, cannot manage in its capital what was considered normal in Pompeii 1,500 years ago. Then they hired engineer Joseph Bazalgette. He built a sewage system, 1,800 kilometers of tunnels. It took 318 million bricks to do this. This is not a typo. 318 million. Hand-mixed, fired, delivered to construction sites. 3.5 million cubic meters of earth were dug out with shovels. Mechanical excavators did not exist. Workers stood in the mud and dug with their hands using iron-tipped tools. The demand for bricks was so high that their price in London rose by 50%, simply because one project consumed so much material that the market couldn't keep up. The question isn't about the number of bricks. The question is, why right now? London had existed for several centuries by that point. Westminster Abbey has been standing since the 11th century. The Tower has been there since the 11th as well. St. Paul's Cathedral was rebuilt in the 17th century. The bridge over the Thames exists. Monumental embankments are being constructed. And only in 1858, after several centuries of the city's existence, did the issue of sanitation finally become urgent. Not because it hadn't been noticed before, but because, until a certain point, it had been somewhat ignored. Until the river became a source of chemical torture right in the building of the Legislative Assembly. This is the same logic as in Versailles. First, the facade. Then, the fountains. Then, 50 years later, figuring out where to dispose of what comes out of humans. The infrastructure of cleanliness always arrives last. It's as if those who were involved in buildings and cities simply had no model for how it should work as a whole. There was a shell, but no systemic understanding of what happens inside that shell with live human beings. Another detail that is seen as an interesting fact, but should be perceived differently. Louis XIV did not have a permanent personal bedroom in the sense we understand it. His stay in any particular chamber was determined by the official schedule of audiences. The morning ritual lever, the King's Rising, took place in the presence of several hundred courtiers. Washing, dressing, and the first meal were all done publicly before the eyes of hundreds of people. Hundreds watched as the king got dressed and had breakfast. This is not an intimate space. This is a stage. And here is the key observation. If the building is a stage for you, then its practical functions do not interest you. The stage does not need to smell good. The stage needs to look good. The decor is important. The plumbing is not. Fountains outside are important because they are seen. Bathrooms inside are not because they are not shown. It's not just a matter of different morals. It's a different logic of space. The building is perceived only as a surface. This is what it means not to understand a building from the inside. This is what it means to use it not as an owner, but as a guest who rents a hall for an event. He knows where the entrance is. He knows what the hall looks like. What is in the service rooms is not his concern. After the event, he will leave. But the residents of Versailles didn't go anywhere. They lived there for 107 years. And still, they didn't understand how the building worked. Ritual, demonstration, presence, but not the everyday logic of the space. Where the water comes from, where the waste goes, how the lower floor is ventilated. These questions were not theirs. They didn't look there. The building exists according to one set of laws. The residents operate under another. They do not align. Versailles is a palace for 1,000 people who possess gold, power, and time. The next place is for those who have nothing, but the structure remains the same. A building that was originally created not for them, and a function that they do not understand. London, 1809. The Workhouse of St. Pancras. Under the Poor Law, revised in 1834, those unable to support themselves otherwise were compelled to go there, to live and work in exchange for shelter and minimal sustenance. Look at the facade of the building. Monumental, symmetrical. A central portico with pilasters, precisely measured proportions, strict brick with stone inlays. This is not a barracks. There is will in this facade, an architectural statement. Someone thought about the scale and the meaning. The projected capacity is 500 people. Over the years, there were 1,900. Official explanation: overcrowding is a result of increasing urban poverty and urbanization. The Industrial Revolution, the proletariat, there weren't enough workhouses. That's all correct, but let's hold off on that explanation for now. 1,900 with a capacity of 500 is not overcrowding as an administrative term. That's 4 people per designated space, 8 people in a room on a bare floor, without bedding, without proper air circulation at such density. This is physiologically dangerous, not in a metaphorical sense, but literally. This is a medical fact. What did archaeologists find during excavations in 2001 when the area was being prepared for new construction? Fragments of bone toothbrushes. Not wooden, bone. It's cheaper than porcelain, but it's an industrial product. Lathe work, trade, supply chain. Someone was thinking about hygiene. Someone was trying to implement it. Ceramic bed warmers are fired clay vessels that were filled with hot water and placed under the blanket. Not primitive, a crafted item. An intention to create at least some minimal comfort. But here is what is most intriguing about the findings. Among the layers of debris, there are remnants of decorative tiles. Not from the floors of the working rooms, but from the walls. A blue and white pattern, more characteristic of hospital corridors or educational buildings from the mid-19th century, where regular wet cleaning was expected. and the hygiene of the surface was important. In a worker's house, where there was no basic plumbing, tiles designed for wet cleaning. Again, a trace of their original purpose that hasn't physically disappeared. It's just that the people who came afterward didn't know what it was for. Think about what this means in context. Among the 8 people sleeping on the bare floor in a room meant for 2, there were those who still cared about having a toothbrush, some who thought about a hot water bottle, some who maintained remnants of an attempt to live normally. This isn't about wealth or poverty. It's about intention. An intention that collided with a system in which it could not be realized, because the system was not designed for it. Now, steam engines. In 1857, steam washing machines were installed in St. Pancras. Progressively, steam was applied to a domestic task. However, coal for the machines needed to be delivered from deep cellars. The cellars were designed in 1809, 48 years before the steam equipment was introduced. Not for this flow of goods. The staircases are narrow, the ceilings are low, and the openings are not intended for regular fuel delivery. People were hauling coal in buckets upstairs that were designed for something entirely different. New technology, old infrastructure. They don't match. No one planned them together. This is a small detail, but precise. It illustrates the overall principle. The building exists. The function was assigned hastily. The technology appears as a patch. No one designed all of this as a system. They simply used what was available. But the strangest question about St. Pancras isn't about coal. What is the purpose of a monumental facade for the impoverished? A workhouse is an institution where people go out of hunger. Architectural symbolism is not needed there. For the state, it's just a cost. Yet there are pilasters, a portico, stone finishes. Inspector reports from the 19th century note, the walls of the women's wards are covered in blue plaster. Blue, pigment, a decorative intention in an institution where 8 people sleep on the bare floor. For whom? The most obvious explanation, state symbolism. Power must appear impressive even in social institutions. Perhaps. But then, why, with such attention to the facade, is the function so poorly thought out? A monumental facade and coal in buckets up the wrong staircases. There is a version, not a statement. A version. The building was not constructed for a workhouse. It was repurposed. Originally, it had a different purpose, different residents, a different scale of use. Then the need arose to house the poor, and so, there is a building, let's put them here. The blue plaster in the women's wards is a remnant, not from a workhouse, something from before it. Consider the logic of this version. If the building was constructed for something else, what exactly was it for? Why is there a monumental facade, wide corridors, high ceilings, decorative plaster in color? For an institution that should instill respect and dignity, not fear and humiliation. A hospital? An educational establishment? An administrative center? Anything but a place of forced labor for the poor. And then times changed, or the purpose changed, or the previous owner left, and the building was given to those who had no idea what to do with it. And they came up with, the poor. Let them be here. This is the mechanics of repurposing. It's not about building for a function, It's a function for the building. Residents come after the building is constructed and adapt as they can. They adapted in different ways. Some took up a toothbrush. Others hung blue plaster. Some carried coal in buckets up the wrong staircases. One thing was common. No one asked why this building was constructed. They just made use of it and stayed silent. Such is the mechanics. It's not about constructing for a function. It's repurposing. Residents move into a building that did not originally belong to them and use it as they can. This mechanism, at its most candid form, is best seen in one place more than anywhere else, in the most famous building in the world, Rome, the Colosseum. More precisely, what it was from the 6th to the 19th century, before it was put under protection and began to be called a monument. 1,300 years. Think about what this figure means. 1,300 years is roughly the same amount of time that has passed since the fall of the Western Roman Empire to our days, if we count from the 17th century. This is an enormous span. During this time, generation after generation, people lived beside the Colosseum, saw it every day, used it as part of their urban environment. And no one, absolutely no one, thought to restore it, or even to understand what it was. All this time, the Colosseum was not protected, nor restored, nor perceived as an object of historical value. It was part of the urban environment, a large building without an owner. It was used as one would use a large abandoned building, like a quarry. Tough slabs, bricks, marble facades, bronze clamps from structural reinforcements. All of this was methodically extracted and relocated for the construction of other buildings. Historians estimate that about 2/3 of the original material was taken from the Colosseum. The Papal Palace, St. Peter's Basilica, the palaces of cardinals, the Bridge of Sant'Angelo. Some were partially built from the stone of the Colosseum. This is not a rumor. It is recorded in official papal permits for borrowing building materials. The documents have been preserved. Stop at this moment. The Pope, the official head of Christian civilization, issues written permits to dismantle the pagan building for building materials. Not secretly, officially, with documentation. This means that the Colosseum was perceived precisely as a quarry, not as a monument, not as a testament to someone else's capabilities, just a convenient source of good stone. This is what it means from an engineering perspective. The travertine of the Colosseum is not just a building stone. It is a specially selected, processed, and numbered material. Each block in the structure occupies its own place. Removing one block from the load-bearing structure means altering the distribution of forces throughout the junction. People did not understand this. They simply took what they needed and dragged it away. That's why, by the 19th century, the building began to shift. It had been dismantled from the inside to a critical limit. Pope Sixtus V in 1594 officially planned to convert the Colosseum into a wool factory. The lower arenas and arches were to be working workshops, while the upper tiers were designated as warehouses, an industrial enterprise in the center of Rome. The project was prepared, but its implementation was halted by Sixtus's death later that same year. One pope passed away, and the Colosseum did not become a factory. A coincidence. Stop at this point. Not at Sixtus, at the very fact of the project itself. To plan a wool factory in the Colosseum, one had to look at the Colosseum and see a large covered space with convenient niches and tiers. Just a large covered space. Not a monument, not a mystery, not an object of study. A place where weaving looms and drying rooms can be comfortably placed. This is not the barbarism or ignorance of Pope Sixtus. This is a normal perception of one's time. That a large stone building without an obvious owner is a resource. Stone, area, volume. Use it. Inside the arches lived people. Wooden partitions within the stone spans, gardens on the crumbling tiers, stables in the lower openings, a smithy, a tannery. At least until the mid-19th century, part of the Colosseum was a residential and industrial area, literally. Now, try to imagine this in detail. An archway of the Colosseum is 8 meters high and about 4 meters wide. The volume of one archway is sufficient for a small courtyard with trees. There are 80 of these archways in the lower level. People would partition them with wooden boards into rooms and place beds inside. Above their heads is a thin partition, and behind it, the next level rises another 8 meters up, and more, and more. In total, there are 4 levels, 50 meters to the upper edge. A person behind a wooden partition under the weight of this structure is like a mouse in the wall of a cathedral. And at the same time, there was no feeling that it was disproportionate. There was no question of why it was built if only one bed could fit there. It was simply a comfortable stone structure. Large, with niches. It's warm in winter. It's shaded in summer. It provides shelter from the wind. Perfect for a forge. Thick walls. Fire won't threaten the neighbors. The function can be anything. The main thing is that there's space. Now, it's a detail that is hard to imagine. 1801 year. British botanist Richard Dean conducts a systematic inventory of the vegetation of the Colosseum. Layer by layer, niche by niche. The result? 420 species of plants. Some are found nowhere else in Italy. Apparently, they were brought in as feed for animals from North Africa, Asia Minor, and the Middle East. In the early centuries of our era, when the arena was operational and wild beasts were brought there for the spectacles. Seeds got lodged in the cracks of the stone, and since then, for 1.5 to 2,000 years, they have been preserved as an isolated population in the crevices of the walls. 420 species. Some are unique to the Apennines. Within the walls of a building that was taken apart stone by stone, where people lived, tended livestock, and forged iron. This means one thing. No one has cleaned there thoroughly enough in 1,800 years to destroy the seeds in the cracks of the stone. The building was not seen as an object that needed care. Just big walls. Just stone. One can live there. One can graze goats. One can gather wild herbs. Here is what was found during the excavations in 2010 and 2011, when, under the guidance of Italian archaeologists, several sections of underground corridors beneath the arena were uncovered. Under the arched vaults of the 1st century AD lay layers from the medieval period, coal lenses from fires, animal bones, fragments of coarse pottery of a completely different type. People lived there, beneath the arena, in technical corridors where animals were brought and kept before battles in the early centuries. They utilized a complex infrastructure of lifts and hatches as living space. By that time, The lift mechanisms no longer functioned, but the pipes and channels under the floor still retained their shape. It was dry and sheltered from the wind there. That was enough. In the early 19th century, buttresses began to be added to the Colosseum. Brick supports, made from ordinary 19th century building bricks, were attached to the travertine walls from the 1st century AD. This was because the structure was starting to shift. The civilization of the 19th century upheld the 2,000-year-old monolithic stone with cheap, modern bricks, either because they knew no other way or because they did not understand how the original construction worked. Now, a comparison for scale. 1831. The French government decides to transport the Luxor obelisk from Egypt to Paris. One monolith, 220 tons. A special transport vessel is constructed with a unique design. A loading system is specially developed. To install it in Paris, part of the waterfront is demolished. The monolith cannot fit through the standard streets. 2.5 million francs. 6 years. One monolith, a state project lasting 6 years. Egypt offered a second obelisk as a gift, free of charge. France declined. The transportation costs were too high. One monolith is at the limit of the budget's capabilities. The second one could not be managed. Now look at the Luxor Temple in Egypt. 24 obelisks. In Karnak, 134 columns, many standing 23 meters tall, each monolithic block weighing 80 to 100 tons. In Abu Simbel, statues that stand 20 meters high, hewn from a solid rock. For those who built these complexes, the transportation and installation of such objects was routine. Not a state project lasting 6 years. Routine. In St. Petersburg, the Alexander Column, 800 tons, 47 meters, was erected in 1834 after 2 years of work. The same era, the same Europe. The difference in possibilities is obvious. For 19th century France, one Egyptian obelisk represents a historical feat. Just one. And there are thousands of them. Imagine that you are an engineer from Egypt in the 1st millennium BC. You are told, you need to erect 40 obelisks in the Karnak temple. Each one weighs between 100 and 200 tons. You nod and start to draft a working plan. How many people will be needed? How much time it will take? How to transport them? How to raise them? For you, this is a problem with a known solution, a routine task. For France, the year 1831 means one such object represents 6 years of a national project, a specially built ship, 2.5 million francs, and the refusal of the second obelisk that was offered for free. The gap in capabilities is not about money. It's about knowledge. It's about how some knew how it was done, while others did not. And that did not know stretched across the entire divide between them. As if something had disappeared, a whole layer of technical expertise, and in its place, only the result. Walls, columns, arches, without an instruction manual. Look at the rhythm. In Egypt, there are thousands of obelisks throughout the country, with 134 columns in Karnak, each monolith weighing under 100 tons. These are not feats of strength. This is the working pace of a construction program. In St. Petersburg, there is only the columned portico of St. Isaac's Cathedral, with 48 columns weighing 114 tons each, and its installation takes 45 years from the first discussion to the last column. This is already a project for a generation, and one obelisk from Luxor for Paris took 6 years and a state budget. As for the second one, They decided not to take it. 3 different levels of capability, 3 different attitudes towards the same type of work. And the gap between them is not a technical progress in the usual sense. It is rather the opposite. The closer we get, the more disposable the feat. For 1,300 years, people lived alongside it and within it, extracting stones from it, planning factories, and did not comprehend it as a system. The thought of restoring it never even crossed their minds. Instead, they envisioned a factory, or a garden, or a stable. In the engravings of Piranesi, an 18th century artist who recorded Rome before the onset of official monument protection, one can see people in rags existing within cyclopean arches, fires burning under the cornices, laundry hanging between the pilasters, goats on crumbling tiers. They live there and perceive these monstrous walls as just an ordinary backyard. They do not look like heirs. They appear to be random occupants, those who have found shelter and are using it. Let's return to the question we started with. The buildings stand. People enter. What happens next? Here are 6 answers to this question, from different countries, different eras, and different social strata. The White City of Chicago. A civilization that knows classical style reproduces it in plaster within 2 years because there isn't enough time for real stone. It spends $28 million to feel like what it once was for 6 months. Exemplary sewage within the perimeter. Cholera in the slums just 2 blocks away. Then it burns. The same Chicago, 1856. The technology of synchronous building lifting on jacks has been mastered in detail. 5,000 jacks, 750 people. The building moves upward. Guests are dining inside. But the city is built on swampy ground without soil assessment. Knowledge of how to lift exists. Knowledge of where to build initially does not. Seattle, 1889. The first floor of an entire city descends underground. 35 blocks of underground galleries. Documented. A tourist route. Edinburgh. 12-story stone houses from the 17th century are being bricked up, not demolished, but simply covered by new buildings on top. The residents breathe in methane and pay rent until 1902. It's also a tourist route. Versailles. 400 fountains, 221 pumps, complex hydraulics, calculated, built, functioning. The restrooms are not completed. 10,000 people use the corridors of Europe's main palace. The same principles are applied outside, but not inside. St. Pancras. A monumental facade, blue plaster in the chambers. 1900, with a capacity of 500. Steam engines installed. Coal is hauled in buckets upstairs not meant for this purpose. The building and its function do not match. No one designed them together. Colosseum. 1,300 years. A quarry, a village, a vegetable garden, an unfulfilled factory. 420 species of unique plants in the niches. Brick supports from the 19th century to the travertine of the 1st. Different countries, different eras, from kings to beggars, but the structure is the same. Look at what is missing from this list. There is not a single case where new tenants have improved the building. There is not a single instance where they figured out how it works and restored what had stopped working. Everywhere it's one way, downward, simplification, temporary solutions, band-aids, prisms for light instead of asking, why is the floor underground? Brick supports for 2,000-year-old travertine, firewood instead of piping. This is a description of a specific type of user. Someone who inherited an object and doesn't know where it came from. who sees the shell but doesn't see the system, who can reproduce an image and doesn't understand how it was created. There is synchronous lifting of 800 tons. There is no understanding of where to build the city. There are 400 fountains with precise pressure calculations. There is no pipe from the reservoir to the toilet. Officially, this period is referred to as the Dark Ages, an era of decline after Rome. But the buildings did not disappear. They stand. There are many of them, entire quarters. It was not construction that fell, it was understanding. The shell remained. This is why Piranesi viewed Rome not as a riddle, but as a landscape. Here are the arches. Here are the goats on the tiers. Everything is ordinary. It is this normal perception of the abnormal that is the most accurate diagnosis. The buildings stand. The question is not who built them. The question is what we know about them, and what we don't know, and why the latter is greater than the former.